In 1995, Taliban forces captured a plane they should never have had, and the story of the pilots inside it will survive for a very long time, maybe forever, because the way they escaped from Taliban territory turned them into one of the most decorated crews in the entire Russian military. 7 men, 100 tons of Soviet aluminum, 378 days of captivity, and a single Friday afternoon in August when everything the world believed was impossible suddenly took off from a dirt runway in Kandahar under Taliban rifle fire. This is the story of how they did it, and it starts with a flight that should have been just another cargo run. On August 3, 1995, during the Afghan Civil War, a Russian cargo plane, an Ilyushin Il-76 TD, registered as RA 76842, was flying from Tirana, Albania, toward Kabul, carrying roughly 30 tons of ammunition for the Afghan government military supplies. The plane belonged to a small Russian operator called Aerostan, based in Kazan in the Republic of Tatarstan. Over southern Afghanistan, a Taliban MiG-21 came up from Kandahar airfield and intercepted the transport, ordering it to land. The Russian crew had no choice. The Il-76 was unarmed, slow, and heavy. They set down on the Kandahar runway and stepped out into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. 7 men were immediately taken into custody: Captain Vladimir Sharpatov, co-pilot Gazanur Khairulin, navigator Alexander Zador, radio operator Yuri Vashvitsov, and flight engineers Oskar Abyazov, Sergei Budazov, and Viktor Ryazantsev. All 7 were from Tatarstan. All 7 now belonged to the Taliban. They were alive for one reason, and only one reason: the Taliban needed the aircraft. Parked on the tarmac at Kandahar sat a 50-meter-long Soviet heavy transport, a machine capable of lifting 50 tons from the kind of rough, improvised airstrips that no Western cargo plane could touch. For a militia running a civil war, an Il-76 was worth more than almost anything else they could capture. But there was a problem. Nobody in the Taliban knew how to operate it. Nobody knew how to maintain it. The only people on that entire airfield who could keep the aircraft alive were the 7 Russians now sitting in a house in Kandahar under armed guard. That's why they survived. The plane was a trophy, and those men were the keys to the trophy. The Taliban also wanted political leverage against Russia. Moscow in 1995 was a wounded country, still recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union, fighting a brutal war in Chechnya, and watching its economy bleed out. The negotiations went nowhere for over a year. The Taliban demanded an official Russian statement of non-interference, and they demanded the return of thousands of Afghans allegedly held in the Soviet Union from the 1979 war. Russia dismissed all of it as fantasy. A Moscow newspaper described the country as smarting at the hands of guerrillas. Tatarstan's government sent its own representatives independently of Moscow, flying food parcels into Kandahar and publicly criticizing the Kremlin for doing nothing. Even the United Nations Security Council mentioned the crew, and the situation drew international attention, including from the United Nations in February 1996, urging their immediate release. Nothing happened. U.S. Senator Hank Brown met with Taliban leadership personally and was told the Russians would remain captive until the alleged Afghan prisoners were freed. The Taliban never provided a single name. The negotiation was theater. The crew spent an Afghan summer, where temperatures ran above 40 degrees Celsius for months, and then an entire winter, watching their own government fail to reach them. No rescue was coming. If they were getting out of Kandahar, they would have to do it themselves. If you're enjoying this video, hit subscribe. It helps us keep bringing you untold stories like this. Captain Sharpatov was the anchor. He kept discipline among the 7 men. He kept morale high, and he came up with a plan nobody else had the nerve to attempt. The crew began asking their guards for one small privilege. They needed to perform routine maintenance on the aircraft, they said, otherwise the plane would rot on the ramp and become worthless. Hydraulic seals would fail, fuel lines would contaminate, avionics would degrade. The Taliban understood money, even if they didn't understand aviation, and after months of patient asking, they agreed. The Russians were allowed to walk out to the Il-76 under armed escort to do mechanical work. And that's exactly when the plan began. Because the crew wasn't really maintaining the whole airplane, they were focusing on one specific system, buried deep in the left landing gear sponson, a small turbine called the Auxiliary Power Unit, or APU. How do you hide a jailbreak in plain sight? You make it look exactly like chores. The guards stood on the tarmac with rifles while the mechanics crawled into wheel wells with grease guns and heavy wrenches. They watched sweating men work over metal joints, and they assumed they were staring at pure boredom. They missed the actual target completely. Here's what the Taliban didn't understand. A massive jet engine like the D-30KP turbofan on an Il-76 cannot be started with a key or a battery. It needs a violent blast of compressed air to spin its core up to ignition speed. At a civilian airport, that blast comes from a heavy ground cart. Without that cart, the plane is dead metal. But built into the Il-76 itself, hidden inside the landing gear, is its own internal turbine, the APU, that generates exactly that blast of compressed air. If the APU runs, the plane can start itself. No ground equipment required. The crew babied that little turbine for months. They wiped down the pressurized lines. They checked the fluid levels. They preserved their only physical exit strategy while disguising the whole thing as routine work. 7 men bet their entire lives on a turbine the size of a washing machine. Friday, August 16, 1996. The crew had been watching their captors for over a year, and they had mapped out exactly when the guards grew tired, when prayer calls pulled attention away, and when commanders refused to stand out in the midday heat. That afternoon, everything aligned. The prayer call drew most of the heavy security detail away from the flight line. The Russians walked out to the aircraft under the usual pretense of maintenance. They climbed into the cockpit with their armed escort watching. They started the APU sequence. They hit the main engine start. Nothing. They tried again. Nothing. On the third attempt, the engine refused to catch. Sweat filled the flight deck. The Taliban commanders, watching from the dirt, decided staring at a dead airplane was a waste of time. And they walked away. They left 3 junior guards inside the cabin to watch the mechanics keep failing. That was their mistake. The moment the commanders disappeared from view, the crew attacked the remaining guards inside the aircraft. They tied them up with whatever they could find. They hit the start sequence one more time. And, on the 4th try, the turbine screamed to life. The compressed air blasted into the first main engine. The blades spun up and caught. That engine bled pressure into the next, and the next, and the next. 48,000 kilograms of thrust came alive on a runway, surrounded by Taliban forces who were finally realizing what was happening. Flight engineer Viktor Ryazantsev later told reporters he just wanted to see his family and his dog. Sharpatov pushed the throttles full forward. The Il-76 surged down the 3,000-meter strip at Kandahar. Taliban soldiers scrambled vehicles onto the concrete to block the plane. A fire truck was driven into position at the end of the runway in a desperate attempt to stop the takeoff. But the Il-76 was carrying no cargo and the absolute minimum fuel load needed for a short sprint to safety. The plane weighed less than half of its maximum design limit, meaning it could lift off in a fraction of its normal distance. The 20 wheels on its heavy landing gear rolled straight over the Taliban blockade. The wings bit into the Afghan heat, and the massive transport lifted off the runway with Kandahar vanishing beneath it. One mistake in the air meant death. The crew kept the Il-76 at roughly 100 meters above the ground, barely rooftop height, according to British newspaper The Independent. They disabled the radio navigation aids to prevent the Taliban from tracking their signal. Flying a 100-ton heavy transport at rooftop altitude across mountain terrain on the Afghan-Pakistani border with no navigation equipment is not something any flight manual ever describes. The route to Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates ran roughly 1,100 kilometers across Iranian and Pakistani airspace. Neither country was notified. Pakistan's aviation authority later confirmed the plane transited without clearance. A Taliban spokesman admitted that their aircraft attempted to chase the Il-76, but they could not catch it. The Taliban's planes were aging Soviet fighters captured from the old Afghan Air Force, held together with limited spare parts. A clean Il-76 with 48,000 kilograms of thrust and a head start was not something they could run down. The crew flew for hours at extreme low altitude, hand-flying the plane through unfamiliar airspace, with 3 bound Taliban guards still in the back. Quick reminder before we finish, if you made it this far, share this history, because we have more stories like this coming. They landed in Sharjah. UAE police questioned the crew and released them. The 3 Taliban guards who had come along for the ride remained in custody. 6 days after the escape, by presidential decree on August 22, 1996, Captain Sharpatov and co-pilot Khairulin were given the title Hero of the Russian Federation. The remaining 5 crew members received the Order of Courage. In 2010, a Russian film called Kandagar was made about the escape, with Sharpatov himself serving as a consultant. The story turned 7 men from a small republic inside Russia into national legends, specifically because they had done what the Kremlin could not. They had rescued themselves using an aircraft their country no longer controlled, from a war their country had already lost, in a place where no government would help them. The Il-76 they flew out of Kandahar was a direct descendant of the same airframes that had carried Soviet paratroopers into Kabul on December 25, 1979, at the very start of the Afghan War. 17 years later, one of those same planes carried 7 Russians back out of the country that had defeated the empire that built it. And the next time someone tells you the impossible cannot be done on a Friday afternoon with a grease gun and a hidden turbine, remember the names Sharpatov, Khairulin, Zor, Vyshivtsov, Abyazov, Butuzov, and Ryazantsev, and ask yourself how history remembers the people who refused to wait for rescue